Hello, and welcome to the Kathleen Spracklin podcast. I am a woman on a mission to help you have the Zettelkasten of your dreams on your work table beside you. Well, today is an exciting moment because we are finally reaching the conclusion of our series on Adler, How to Read a Book. We're concluding with a syntopical reading. I have added the last cards to my adorable little bib card on a ring, and I have included the syntopical reading. I'm going to share the cards with you, but far more important than the cards are what the underlying differences are between analytical reading and syntopical reading. Of course, they're parallel, very, very similar, but oh, the difference is so important. Of course, what makes syntopical reading different from analytical reading is key to the whole process. So come on over to the down-facing camera. I'll show you my little cards. We'll talk about the book, Adler's How to Read a Book, and we'll go over how syntopical reading differs from analytical reading. Some surprises for me, let me tell you. See you over there. Okay, the interesting part of syntopical reading, right at the beginning, is that there are two phases of syntopical reading. We're used to another kind of reading that had two phases. Inspectional reading had two phases. The first phase of inspectional reading took us into flipping around through the book, and the second phase of inspectional reading had us actually read straight through the book. Well, now we're seeing two phases in syntopical reading, and they're really, really interesting. The first phase Adler simply calls surveying the field. And what Adler wants you to do there is create the entire bibliography for everything that you want to look at that pertains to the question that you're investigating. In that regard, it is very like Umberto Eco's How to Write a Thesis. And I would imagine that his book would be of tremendous value in establishing your bibliography, because you're going to create a very broad bibliography, perhaps as many as 100 references if you're doing a really serious work. And then phase 2, he wants you to read them. What? Read them? 100 references? The rest of your life? Well, no. But he wants you to read all of them inspectionally. And remember what he said with inspectional reading in that first phase, you're supposed to be able to accomplish that within an hour. So that means if you're going to be looking at 100 references, you should be able to do it in 100 hours. Not trivial, but not your whole life either. So what you're supposed to be doing with this is narrowing down your bibliography and refining your question. You're going to be coming into syntopical reading with a question that you want to investigate. And ideally, or at least that's the way Adler presents it, at the beginning, your question is not fully formed. You have a hunch, an area, a field, a specialization, something that is of great interest to you, but perhaps you have not, and he advises you not to prematurely totally nail down the question that you're going to want to answer. He feels that that is going to come about through reading this bibliography. So when you're done inspectionally reading all of the sources, you will gradually weed them out to just the sources that you think are going to be worth carrying forward into your project. And by that process, you will be coming up with a better definition of what you're looking for. So here's the cards I made for the two steps in stage 1 of syntopical reading. Stage 1, he calls surveying the field. You're going to create the tentative bibliography. And the next card is read all of the bibliography inspectionally, whereupon you're ready for stage 2. Now, stage 2 is tighter. You've inspectionally read all of the bibliography. Now what we're going to be doing with it is we're going to identify the most relevant passages in the tightly selected list of books that you've decided you're really going to read syntopically. And what's interesting here, you've now refined your question, so you're bringing your question into the book and you're identifying what areas of the few selected books that you've narrowed it down to, which passages in those books are you going to really read? Pretty interesting, isn't it? Because in analytical reading, we were reading the whole book and we were looking for what the author was telling us the book is about. So we were saying, what is the book about as a whole? So now what we're coming in with is, what is our question as a whole? We're in the driver's seat now, and you're going to watch that happen again and again with all of the steps in syntopical reading. You're not sitting there as the scholar, as the student. You're sitting there as the potential author of a new work in the field. You're in the driver's seat. So remember when the first step in analytical reading was to come to terms with the author? Look at this reversal. We're going to bring the authors to terms. That means we're going to set the glossary, and it's going to be up to us to say, okay, this author calls it this and that author calls it that, but this is the thing I'm interested. I see that they use two different names. This is the name I'm going to use for it. And I understand that when I read this one saying this term and that one saying that term, they are talking about the thing I'm interested in, my glossary. Now that's rather interesting because just a few days ago, I came up with a personal reflection card. It was on the question of terms. And I had noted that Scott Shepper advocates keeping a vocabulary box where you pick up terms as you learn them. But it occurred to me, of course, that the terms that we're dealing with when we're dealing with papers might not be the ordinary dictionary definition of a word. We're talking about quite possibly the specialized use of a word by a given author. And if that's the case, the glossary isn't going to be useful because it's not going to unite us, as I noted. It's going to divide us because this term will show up there and the other author's term will show up in another place and never the two are going to meet. That somehow you had to be, the only way to join them is to identify the thing and not the term for it. Well, guess what? Now we've met back up with Adler. This card anticipates Adler because we are going to give the name for the thing and we will have our own translation table between the author's use of terms. Okay. The next thing we're going to set is the propositions. You remember with analytical reading, what we did next after coming to terms is we looked at the propositions that the author stated and the details that he provided in support of those propositions. Well, we've got the hat on now. We're leading. We have the baton conducting the orchestra. So it is up to us to establish the set of neutral propositions. And then, of course, if we've gotten our list of propositions, alongside that, we are going to be looking at how the individual authors speak to the propositions that we just established. And in particular, what we're going to be looking for are issues. Issues are situations where author 1 and author 2 take different stands on one of our propositions. That's going to be very, very interesting for us because we're definitely going to want to find out what's going on when the two authors disagree. And as our last step in syntopical reading, we're going to analyze the discussion. Guess what? That's output. That is us putting our work out into the world. Okay, so we've got all of these cards. How does that relate to a Zettelkasten? And how does the process differ if you have a Zettelkasten versus if you're operating just spreading all the books out in front of you? Now, we noted before that if you just want to analytically read one book and then analytically read another book and analytically read yet another book, and possibly all in the same field, you would be able to do those independently and even time differentially by maybe years apart reading those books. And the fact that you're keeping a Zettelkasten so that the ideas go into the Zettelkasten would mean that no matter how far apart you spread those works, the ideas would still interact. It would not be necessary to spread them all out on your desk and read them at once. Well, okay, but that's still not syntopical reading, because syntopical reading, the key word in the midst of all of that is topic. And that means you've got a topic in mind that you are taking to the books. Sertolanges talks about the difference between reading for formation and reading for information. That's the same concept. When you're reading a book fully, you're taking the author as being your guru. You're asking yourself, is it true and what of it? But you're basically putting yourself in the position of understanding the author and everything he has to say. Is a very different experience than bringing your question to the author and saying basically, what have you got to say about this? And Adler talks about the fact that you're going to sometimes have to dig out the answers because the author may not have addressed your question directly, and you can't go back to him and say, okay, you talked about all these other things closely related. What about this point? You just have to dig it out and ferret it out. So that's quite a different process. So does that mean that then you have to spread all the books out in front of you at once? You'd almost think so, because Adler says that when you got that list of 100 titles, then the very next thing you're supposed to do is read all 100 superficially before you read any of them analytically or even syntopically. So that implies a simultaneity, at least in the sense that you will review the entire bibliography first before you launch into any of your work. And they do make a quality case for that. They do say that many students become very eager to dive into their thesis topic, and they start reading everything on their list with the same degree of concentration and the same intensity. And that might not be necessary at all. And that could end up being a terrible wastage of time, plus leaving the student feeling very diffuse about what it is they actually even believe or want to bring up as their contention. So it's very, very handy to have at least a nebulous question going in, and then weed through those sources and narrow down the sources. Now, fine. Now you've done that. Now at that point, you are free to actually read the books one after the other, after the other. You really do not have to spread them all out on your desk and read them at once. You might find that the questions evolve as you go along, and that by the time you get to the third book, by golly, the two questions you thought were going to be the most important turned out to be less important, and there's another one looming in importance. Well, you may have to take that question back to the first two books that you thought you were done with. But there's nothing wrong with that. You can always reread a book. So at that point in time, you get all the advantages of a Zettelkasten, because all of your ideas that you're taking out of these books will find a home in your Zettelkasten, no matter how widespread they are. And if this is your field and this is your life work, your sources are going to be spread out in time, because you're going to continue living your life and you're going to continue adding information to your Zettelkasten. So I hope you've enjoyed going through Adler's How to Read a Book with me. Again, if you don't yet have it, it's time to acquire it and make your own little bib card on a ring, because Adler has an awful lot to say on how to read a book. And there are many chapters that we did not go into that are more specific, that may fit your area of study, that you will definitely want to go to, and a lot of information about how in general to get more out of your reading. So the only things that we really covered is what's going to impact your world with your Zettelkasten. It's a powerful tool that Adler doesn't mention, but weighs marvelously into your capabilities when you take your Zettelkasten to a book. So I hope you've enjoyed this series, and we will begin a new series starting with the next podcast. So follow along with the new series, and I hope to see you there. Bye-bye.